In a city that thrived on its diversity yet held subtle divisions, Officer Luke Grant was known for his firm, often unforgiving stance as a cop. To Luke, order and authority were paramount, and he took pride in enforcing the law with an iron fist. He patrolled an upscale neighborhood on a bright morning, his gaze scanning for anything out of place. To him, maintaining control meant more than simply following procedure. It was a personal mission to assert his sense of right and wrong. As he turned a corner, he caught sight of a sleek, polished luxury car parked along a stretch of boutiques and high-end cafes. Behind the wheel sat a well-dressed black woman with an air of effortless elegance. Her presence was both commanding and serene, as if she belonged here more than anyone else. But Luke's mind immediately registered something else. He noted the car and its driver with suspicion. To him, it was a scene that didn't fit. Without hesitation, he flipped on his lights and pulled up behind her car. As he approached, she rolled down her window, her expression calm, with a hint of curiosity. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice lacking any semblance of warmth. She complied without a word, her calm demeanor seeming to irk him more than reassure him. Luke looked over her documents with a critical eye, searching for any reason, however small, to justify his suspicions. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice polite but steady, hinting that she had dealt with situations like this before. "Funny you should ask," he replied, a sarcastic smile twitching at the corner of his mouth. "What brings you here today? Just passing through?" The question dripped with implication, as though her presence alone warranted his suspicion. The woman didn't flinch. "I live here," she replied, her gaze steady on him. "Is that unusual?" He scoffed, casting a judgmental glance at the car and then back at her. "We don't see too many people like you around here driving cars like this," he said, his voice lower but unmistakably condescending. "Are you sure you're not lost?" The woman let out a sigh, her composure unshaken. She looked at him carefully, studying his face with a mixture of disappointment and resignation, but she stayed silent, seemingly unwilling to engage further with his line of questioning. Feeling his authority challenged by her calm indifference, Luke leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I'm just making sure you're not here for any suspicious reasons," he said, his gaze cold. "You understand, of course." "Yes, officer, I understand," she said, her voice calm but carrying a hint of reproach that was unmistakable. She looked away, dismissing him with an ease that left him feeling small and unsettled. Frustrated but unwilling to let his irritation show, he straightened up and returned her documents with a curt nod. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her than he had assumed. She hadn't acted like most people he encountered in situations like this. She was calm, dignified, and unbothered by his intimidation tactics, something he wasn't used to. It gnawed at him, making him question if he had indeed crossed a line. Unbeknownst to him, this woman was Dr. Naomi Fields, an esteemed medical researcher and the wife of his newly appointed superior, Chief James Fields. The following day, as Luke arrived at the station, he noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Officers greeted him as usual, but there was a slight pause, a hint of tension he couldn't quite place. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to his own unsettled mind, and got to work as normal. Then he saw Chief Fields making his way across the station toward him, his face impassive but his stride purposeful. Luke straightened up instinctively, sensing this wasn't a routine interaction. "Grant, I need a word," Chief Fields said, his voice measured. Luke followed him into his office, feeling a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Chief Fields closed the door and motioned for him to sit, but Luke remained standing, a habit of deference he thought might help diffuse whatever tension he felt brewing. "Yesterday, there was an incident reported in the Bellevue district," Fields began, his tone calm but with a quiet intensity that made Luke uneasy. "I was informed that you stopped a civilian for what appeared to be less than legitimate reasons." He held Luke's gaze, giving him no room to dodge the question. Luke cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Yes, sir. I encountered a woman driving a high-end vehicle in an area where..." Chief Fields held up a hand, silencing him. "I don't need the specifics, Officer Grant. I need to know why you felt it necessary to stop someone who wasn't breaking any laws." Luke swallowed, trying to keep his face neutral. "I was following protocol, sir, ensuring no unauthorized individuals were loitering." Fields' gaze sharpened, his jaw clenching subtly. "Is that what we're calling it now?" he asked, his voice laced with a calm intensity that struck Luke like a blow. "Let me be clear, Grant. This is not the first time I've received reports of this kind about you." Luke's face tightened as he listened, a mix of surprise and indignation bubbling within him. "With all due respect, sir, I don't believe I acted outside of my duties," he said, struggling to keep his tone even. "I was ensuring the neighborhood's safety, as I always do." Fields leaned back, crossing his arms as he regarded Luke carefully. "Grant, if you're incapable of seeing the bias in your actions, that's a problem," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. "And if you're unwilling to change, that's a bigger problem." Luke felt his face flush, anger flaring within him, but he held his tongue. Chief Fields' words stung more than he'd expected, and he could feel the weight of an unspoken threat hanging between them. "You need to understand that there are consequences for this kind of behavior," Fields continued, his gaze hardening. "And I assure you, Grant, this precinct does not tolerate officers who misuse their authority." As Fields dismissed him, Luke left the office feeling an uncomfortable blend of resentment and fear. He knew now that his every move would be watched, his actions scrutinized. What he didn't realize, however, was the deeper implication behind Chief Fields' words. Back at home, the day's events still clung to Luke like a shadow. He felt the unspoken judgment in his superior's eyes, the quiet disgust that lingered in Fields' words. His mind raced through the encounter, replaying every moment, every pause. Had he truly been unfair? Or was this simply a case of bad timing, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion? Yet, somewhere deep within, he felt a prick of unease he couldn't ignore, a nagging sense that his assumptions had blinded him, that he had, perhaps, crossed a line he couldn't quite see. As he sat in silence, the memory of the woman's unflinching gaze haunted him. She hadn't reacted the way he'd expected, hadn't shown the deference he was used to. She had simply looked at him, a look that now seemed to echo in his mind. Days passed, but Luke couldn't shake the tension growing around him. There was a new vigilance in the station, a subtle but palpable shift that seemed directed at him. Colleagues he'd once confided in now gave him sidelong glances or cut conversations short, leaving him to stew in the silence. And, like a slow-rolling storm, something darker was brewing within him. His frustration at being reprimanded and watched fed into an anger he couldn't direct at anyone but himself. One evening, after a long shift, he came home to find an envelope slipped under his door. It was small, plain, and unmarked, yet somehow ominous. He opened it, and his heart sank. Inside was a photograph, a candid shot of him embracing his mistress Jenna in a secluded park where they thought they'd been safe from prying eyes. His blood ran cold as he flipped the photo over. Scrawled on the back in neat, printed handwriting was a single line: "How long before everyone knows?" Panic hit him like a wave. Who had taken this photo? Who would send it to him, and more importantly, why? His mind raced through possibilities, his fear quickly giving way to anger. He felt cornered, as though invisible hands were tightening around him. All his instincts, honed from years of policing, told him that someone was targeting him, and they knew enough to threaten everything he'd worked to protect. The next day, he walked into the precinct with new resolve. He planned to find out who was behind this, to root them out before his reputation was permanently ruined. But as he passed through the halls, he felt the weight of Chief Fields' gaze on him, watching every move. The chief's watchful presence reminded him that the situation was already fragile. If he acted recklessly, he'd risk drawing more suspicion. Later that day, Fields called him into his office again. Luke's heart thudded in his chest, a mix of nerves and defiance stealing his posture as he walked through the door. Fields was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable as he gestured for Luke to sit. Luke took a seat, feeling every second stretch as Fields remained silent, letting the tension build. "Grant, there's an assignment that requires a particular kind of officer," Fields said, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made Luke uneasy. "I need someone who understands high-risk operations, someone willing to take on difficult circumstances." Luke frowned, his mind trying to decipher what Fields was getting at. Fields leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "This is an undercover operation," he continued, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "We're infiltrating a dangerous narcotics ring that's been elusive for years. I'm giving you the chance to prove yourself, to show that you're more than the sum of certain actions." Luke knew what was being implied. Fields was offering him a way out, a chance to redeem himself or, at the very least, divert attention from the recent incident. But there was something in Fields' gaze, a subtle flicker that suggested this wasn't simply a chance at redemption, it was a test. Failure wouldn't be tolerated, and the consequences could be dire. He accepted the assignment, his mind racing with a mixture of dread and determination. This mission was his chance to prove himself, to show that he was still worthy of the badge he wore. Yet, as he left Fields' office, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this operation was about more than drugs or redemption. It was a carefully constructed trap, a high-stakes gauntlet designed to push him to his limits. The following week, Luke met with Chris Morales, a seasoned narcotics agent known for his unflinching approach and gritty reputation. Morales eyed him with a hint of skepticism as they shook hands, his gaze assessing, almost probing. Luke felt the scrutiny but kept his expression neutral, determined to show he was ready for this assignment. Their task was to infiltrate the notorious Alvarez cartel, a powerful network responsible for the city's drug supply. Morales briefed him on their targets, the key players, and their roles. Among them was Marco, a high-ranking enforcer with a reputation for sniffing out undercover cops and dealing with them ruthlessly. Morales warned him about Marco specifically, advising him to maintain constant vigilance and trust no one. The operation was tense from the start. Luke found himself thrust into a world that felt foreign yet disturbingly familiar, one where distrust was the rule and betrayal lurked around every corner. In his new persona, he shadowed Morales through a series of introductions, each encounter a test of his nerve. They met with low-level dealers, runners, and finally, Marco himself. Marco's gaze lingered on Luke longer than he was comfortable with, a hard, calculating stare that seemed to dissect him. In their first real test, Marco assigned Luke to drive a shipment across town, instructing him to meet an associate at a specified location. As he loaded the vehicle, he noticed Morales watching him from the shadows, a silent reminder of the stakes. If he failed here, if he slipped up, he'd be alone, and there would be no one to back him up. He could feel his palms sweating, his nerves raw as he tried to steady his breathing. As the deal progressed, his unease grew. The air was thick with tension, and he felt eyes on him, watching for any mistake, any flicker of fear. Every word he said felt loaded, every glance he exchanged filled with suspicion. By the end of the night, he was exhausted, his body tense with the constant vigilance required to keep his cover intact. And yet, a part of him thrived on the rush, the thrill of danger that numbed his gnawing fears and insecurities. One night, Marco cornered him, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized Luke's every move. "So, tell me, Luke," he said, his voice casual but his tone anything but. "Why'd you want to work with us? What's in it for you?" Luke's mind raced, every nerve on edge as he scrambled for a believable answer. "I got tired of living small," he replied, forcing a smirk. "This is where the real action is. You understand, right?" Marco didn't react, his gaze hard and unyielding. For a tense moment, Luke thought he'd seen through him, that his cover was blown. But then Marco simply nodded, as if satisfied for now, though Luke could sense that the man's suspicions lingered. The turning point came during a high-stakes heist, a carefully coordinated operation involving multiple cartel members and a massive shipment. Morales and Luke were assigned as part of the crew, tasked with securing the deal. But as they arrived at the location, the sound of sirens filled the air. Luke's stomach dropped, realizing it was a police raid. Panic erupted as the cartel members scattered, shouting orders and scrambling to escape. Marco turned on Luke, his eyes filled with betrayal and fury. "You set us up," he snarled, reaching for his weapon. Luke barely had time to react, his training kicking in as he blocked the blow and wrestled with Marco in a desperate struggle. Amid the chaos, Morales intervened, pulling Luke aside and shielding him from a hail of gunfire. Together, they managed to evade the worst of the firefight, watching as Fields' team swept in and apprehended the cartel members, including Marco. But as the dust settled, Luke felt a deep, unsettling realization take hold. He had come face to face with death, with betrayal, and had barely escaped unscathed. He was no longer the officer he had been. This operation had changed him, revealing parts of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to see. As they regrouped back at the precinct, Luke felt the weight of his actions settle on him, heavier than ever before. The lines he had crossed, the lies he had told, they all seemed to catch up with him, a relentless wave of guilt and self-reproach. And yet, there was no going back. He had survived, but at what cost? The aftermath of the operation left Luke in a state of quiet turmoil. Back at the precinct, he felt like a stranger among his colleagues, even more isolated than before. Chief Fields called him into his office again, but this time there was no lecture, no veiled threats. Fields was brief, professional, and disturbingly calm. "You did well," Fields said, his gaze fixed on Luke with an unreadable intensity. "Consider this a second chance, but let me make one thing clear. This was your last. I don't expect to have another conversation about your conduct." Luke could barely muster a response. He nodded, keeping his gaze steady, though internally he felt his composure slipping. Fields dismissed him, and as Luke left the office, he realized just how exhausted he was. The weight of the past few weeks had drained him completely. Every muscle in his body felt heavy, his mind clouded by conflicting thoughts and emotions that he couldn't unravel. Returning home that night, Luke sat alone in his dimly lit living room, his mind racing through everything he had experienced. The undercover mission had taken him to a place he hadn't anticipated. He'd been forced to confront not only the dangerous criminals he'd infiltrated, but also the deep flaws within himself. He realized, perhaps for the first time, how far he had strayed from the values he once believed in. His mind returned to the woman in the luxury car, the encounter that had sparked this spiral. Her calm, dignified response to his insults now haunted him. She hadn't flinched under his condescension, hadn't let his prejudiced remarks touch her. And that unshakable calm had revealed to him something unsettling, that his assumptions, his bias, had always been there, shaping the way he saw people, even if he hadn't acknowledged it. He could no longer ignore the truth, that the humiliation he'd tried to impose on her was nothing compared to the shame he now felt. His gaze shifted to the photo that had been slipped under his door, the reminder of his affair. In the rush of the operation, he had nearly forgotten about it, but now the image was a glaring symbol of his hidden flaws, the tangled web he had woven in his personal life that was now suffocating him. For months, he had balanced two separate lives, his role as a strict enforcer of the law and his secret life filled with lies and betrayal. But the operation, the raid, and the near-death encounters had stripped away his defenses, leaving him to confront the man he had become. He sat in silence for hours, thinking about his wife, about Jenna, his mistress, and the deception that had tainted every corner of his life. He hadn't realized just how much of himself he'd lost until now. He had become numb, letting his anger and frustrations dictate his actions, both on and off the job. And in doing so, he'd not only lost sight of who he was, but had also jeopardized the lives of those he claimed to care for. The following days passed in a haze of routine and self-reflection. He went through the motions, clocking in at the precinct, doing his job, and keeping his head down. Fields had been true to his word. There were no further consequences for the incident. But Luke felt the judgment from his colleagues, the quiet whispers that followed him down the halls, the sidelong glances that told him he was no longer trusted. The station, once a place of camaraderie and purpose, now felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. One evening, after yet another tense, silent dinner with his wife, he found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for something he could recognize. His own face looked foreign to him, worn and hardened by months of internal battles and sleepless nights. He knew he couldn't keep living like this, that something had to change. But he wasn't sure where to begin, or if he even had the strength to start over. Desperation drove him to Jenna's apartment late one night. She opened the door, surprised and wary, her gaze flickering over his haggard expression. They hadn't spoken since the raid, and as he stepped into her home, he realized how distant they had become, even before all of this had started. She led him to the couch, and they sat in silence, neither willing to break the heavy quiet that filled the room. Finally, she spoke, her voice low but steady. "What's going on, Luke? You look lost." Her words cut through him, sharper than any reprimand he'd ever received. She wasn't accusing him, wasn't demanding answers. She was simply stating what was painfully obvious, something he had been avoiding for too long. He felt the shame rise in him, a hot, suffocating wave that made it difficult to speak. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The admission left him feeling vulnerable, exposed, but he knew he couldn't hold it in any longer. Jenna watched him, her expression softening. "Luke, maybe it's time you face it. Face yourself. Whatever you're running from, it's not going to disappear." Her words settled over him like a weight, yet they brought a strange sense of relief. He hadn't come here for comfort, but somehow, her honesty felt like the first real connection he'd had in weeks. They sat together in silence, and for the first time in a long while, Luke felt a glimmer of clarity. He realized that he needed to confront the choices he'd made, to find a way to make peace with himself, even if that meant losing everything he had tried so hard to hold on to. The next morning, he made a decision. He would tell his wife about the affair, about the mistakes he had made, and accept whatever consequences came from it. He couldn't live with the lies any longer, couldn't keep running from himself. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and he knew that facing the truth was the only way he could begin to rebuild the fractured pieces of his life. As he drove home that evening, he thought about Dr. Fields, the woman in the luxury car. He realized that she had been a mirror, reflecting back to him the prejudice he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Her quiet strength had exposed his weaknesses, forced him to confront his own faults. And in a strange way, he felt grateful. Her dignity, her refusal to be diminished by his words, had set him on this painful journey, had forced him to see himself as he truly was. Back at home, his wife was waiting for him, her expression cautious as he walked through the door. He knew that what he was about to say would hurt her, that it might shatter the life they had built together. But for the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet resolve that steadied his voice as he began to speak. The conversation was long, painful, and filled with tears. His wife listened, her face etched with hurt and disbelief, but she didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a heavy silence between them, a gulf that seemed impossible to bridge. Yet in that silence, Luke felt a glimmer of hope, a chance, however small, to start again. In the days that followed, Luke began to make amends, one small step at a time. He knew that forgiveness would not come easily, that he would have to earn back the trust he had shattered, but he was willing to try, to face the consequences of his actions and rebuild the life he had nearly destroyed. At the precinct, he worked with renewed purpose, determined to be the officer he had once aspired to be. He was no longer the man who had sneered at others, who had used his authority to belittle and intimidate. Instead, he found himself listening more, questioning less, and striving to understand the people he served. And in his quiet moments, he thought of Dr. Fields, the woman whose strength had changed him in ways he hadn't thought possible. Her silent defiance had been a lesson he would carry with him, a reminder of the impact of his actions and the cost of his prejudice. Luke's journey was far from over, and he knew there would be days when the weight of his past mistakes would feel unbearable. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose, a path forward that, though difficult, was grounded in honesty and humility. And as he took each step, he found that the person staring back at him in the mirror was someone he was finally beginning to recognize. Luke walked through the precinct with a sense of quiet humility, his steps measured and deliberate. He knew he was still under the careful watch of his colleagues, and he accepted it as part of his journey. The tension was still there, the unspoken judgment lingering in their glances, but he no longer felt the need to defend himself. He understood, finally, that their scrutiny was well earned. His past actions had consequences that could not simply be brushed aside. Over the next few weeks, he noticed subtle changes in his approach to his job. The interactions that once felt routine now carried a depth he hadn't considered before. Each person he encountered, each complaint, each call for help, was an opportunity for him to serve with empathy and understanding. He began to see the individuals he once dismissed through a different lens, recognizing their struggles as a reflection of his own. The detachment he once clung to as a means of authority had been replaced by something softer, something grounded in a genuine desire to connect and protect. One afternoon, as he patrolled a familiar part of the city, he spotted a young man standing on a street corner, looking tense and unsure. Luke recognized the signs immediately: the furtive glances, the anxious shifting. The young man seemed poised to make a choice, caught in a moment that could tip toward something dark or something redemptive. Instead of approaching with his usual authority, Luke softened his stance, his voice calm as he greeted the young man. "You good?" he asked, his tone casual yet warm. The young man looked up, surprised, his guard momentarily dropping. "Just waiting for a friend," he replied, though his body language betrayed his nerves. Luke nodded, not pressing further. He could feel the weight of his own past in this moment, a quiet reminder of the times he had made judgments too quickly, the assumptions that had led him down a path he now regretted. Instead of prying, he simply stood nearby, offering a silent presence that conveyed both understanding and accountability. After a few minutes, the young man relaxed, and they exchanged a few words about the weather, about the neighborhood. It was a simple conversation, one that ended with a nod and a quiet, "Take care." But Luke felt the significance of it linger, a small act of compassion that might one day ripple into something larger. As he continued his shift, Luke found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, to this moment of quiet grace. The choices he had made, the mistakes he had owned, all seemed to lead him to this new understanding. He realized that change didn't come from grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was in the small, everyday decisions, the willingness to be humble, to learn, to listen. In the evenings, he would return home to the wife he had nearly lost, their conversations now filled with a raw honesty that, while painful, felt liberating. They were rebuilding, one fragile moment at a time. Trust was slow to return, and he could see the hurt still etched in her eyes, but she was willing to walk this path with him, to give him a chance to prove he could be the man she once believed in. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to share his fears and insecurities. It was a process of unlearning, of letting go of the defenses he had built around himself, and he was grateful for her patience, her resilience. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset in comfortable silence, she reached over, placing her hand on his. He looked at her, surprised by the gesture, and she offered him a soft smile. "I see the change in you," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "I know it's not easy, and I know we still have a long way to go, but I see it, and I'm proud of you." Her words washed over him, filling him with a quiet strength he hadn't known he needed. He realized then that this journey wasn't just about redemption, it was about love, about finding his way back to the people who mattered most. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise that he would continue to do the work, to be the man she deserved. At the precinct, he began to notice a shift in how his colleagues interacted with him. The initial distance and suspicion began to fade, replaced by a subtle respect. They saw the changes in him, the effort he was putting into his work and his life. He had become more approachable, more willing to lend a hand or offer support without expecting anything in return. The transformation was slow, but it was real, and with each day, he felt more at peace with the man he was becoming. In a surprising turn, Chief Fields called him into his office one afternoon. Luke entered, unsure of what to expect, but Fields' expression was different this time. There was no judgment, no anger, only a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. "I've been watching you, Grant," Fields began, his tone thoughtful. "I'll admit I didn't expect you to come this far, but you've shown me something I don't see often in this line of work: real growth. I know that doesn't erase the past, but it means something." Luke nodded, gratitude filling him as he listened. Fields continued, his gaze steady. "There's a new training program we're launching, one that focuses on de-escalation, empathy, and community outreach. I think you'd be a good fit to lead it." The offer took Luke by surprise, and he felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. He realized that this was more than just a promotion or a new role. It was a chance to give back, to use his experience, his mistakes, as a way to guide others. He accepted, knowing that this was the next step in his journey, a path that would allow him to continue growing, to make amends for the harm he had caused. The following weeks were filled with preparation, as Luke threw himself into the training program with a renewed sense of purpose. He crafted workshops, simulations, and discussions aimed at fostering empathy and helping officers see the people they served as individuals with their own struggles and stories. He drew from his own experiences, sharing the moments that had shaped him, the mistakes that had humbled him. The vulnerability wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and he could see the impact it had on the young officers who looked up to him. One day, as he was wrapping up a session, he noticed a familiar figure standing in the doorway, Dr. Naomi Fields. She had come to observe the training, her gaze thoughtful as she watched him lead the group through an exercise on active listening. When the session ended, she approached him, her expression softened by a quiet pride. "You've come a long way, Officer Grant," she said, her voice carrying a warmth he hadn't expected. "I can see the difference in you, and I hope you know that what you're doing here, it matters." Her words brought a sense of closure, a feeling that he had finally reached a place of acceptance. He nodded, a quiet gratitude filling him as he met her gaze. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady, "for everything. I don't think I would have found this path if it hadn't been for that day." She gave him a knowing smile, a silent understanding passing between them. He realized then that forgiveness wasn't just about making amends, it was about transforming, about finding a way to turn pain into something meaningful. And he had done that, not only for himself but for those around him, for the community he had once failed. As Dr. Fields left, Luke felt a sense of peace settle over him. He knew his journey was far from over, that there would be more challenges, more moments of reckoning. But he was no longer running from himself. He was facing his life, his choices, with a newfound strength and humility. That evening, as he walked home, he felt the weight of his past finally lifting. He had found a way to make amends, to rebuild the trust he had broken, and to become a better man, one small step at a time. And in that journey, he had discovered a deeper purpose, a reason to keep going, to keep learning, and to keep serving, not out of duty, but out of a genuine desire to make a difference. For the first time in a long time, he felt whole, at peace with the man he had become and the life he was building.